You know what's strange? We talk endlessly about millennials. We blame them for killing industries. We call them entitled, oversensitive, financially irresponsible. We've turned an entire generation into a punchline about avocado toast and participation trophies. But there's a specific slice of this generation that nobody actually examines. The ones who grew up poor. Not struggling a little poor, not we didn't go on vacation that year poor. Checking the price tag before you even picked it up poor. Pretending you weren't hungry so your sibling could eat more poor. And here's what nobody tells you. Their psychology looks nothing like the millennial stereotype, because the experiences that shaped them were nothing like what people assume. Picture this. It's 1995. You're 9 years old, standing in a grocery store checkout line. The cashier is scanning items one by one, and you're already doing math in your head. Not because anyone taught you to, but because you've learned to watch your mom's face. You know the exact expression she makes when the total is climbing too high. You know what it means when she puts something back without saying a word. You didn't learn that in school. You learned it by paying attention, because the stakes felt real, even at 9 years old. That's not a childhood memory for a lot of millennials who grew up poor. That's a formative psychological event, and it left a mark that most of them are still carrying. A study published in the Journal of Family Psychology found that children who experience chronic financial strain before the age of 12 show measurably different patterns of stress response activation, patterns that persist well into adulthood, even after their financial situation has significantly improved. In plain terms, the nervous system doesn't automatically get the memo that the emergency is over. It just keeps scanning, keep watching, keep preparing for the floor to drop out. This isn't a character flaw, it's an adaptation, and it makes complete sense when you understand what these kids were actually navigating. Millennials born between 1981 and 1996, who grew up in low-income households, didn't experience money as background noise. Money was the main character of the household. It determined the temperature of every room, whether dinner was tense or relaxed, whether a conversation between parents stayed quiet or got loud. You didn't need anyone to explain scarcity to you. You lived inside it, and your brain, still developing, still plastic, still building the frameworks it would use for the rest of your life, absorbed all of it. So what does that actually look like in adulthood? Because this is where it gets specific, and if you grew up this way, you'll recognize these immediately. The first thing is hypervigilant budgeting. Millennials who grew up poor tend to calculate the total before the cashier does. They track the running number in their head at the grocery store. They know their account balance to the dollar without checking. And this doesn't go away when the income improves. A person who earns a comfortable salary today and still flinches at spending $30 on themselves isn't being irrational. They're running a program that was written when $30 meant the difference between making rent or not. Psychologists call this financial hypervigilance. It's the brain doing exactly what it was trained to do, protecting you from a threat it learned was real. The second thing is guilt around spending on themselves. This one runs deeper than most people expect. When you watched your parents sacrifice, skipping meals, wearing things until they fell apart, never buying anything just because they wanted it, you absorbed a message. Wanting things for yourself is selfish. Spending on yourself is reckless. Comfort is something you haven't earned yet. So now they make decent money, and they still feel vaguely wrong about buying something nice. The third pattern is chronic over-delivering at work. Research on scarcity and threat-based motivation shows that people who grew up in financially unstable environments often develop an excessive need to prove their value in professional settings. They arrive early, they stay late, they take on more than they should, and struggle to say no. Not because they're ambitious exactly, but because something underneath is whispering that being replaceable is dangerous. That if you stop being useful, the rug gets pulled. They watched job loss happen to people they loved. They watched how fast things could collapse. So they work like their financial safety depends on never being the weakest link in the room. Because, at one point, it did. The fourth pattern is difficulty asking for help. This one is quiet, but persistent. When you grew up in a house where there wasn't enough, asking for things often led to one of two outcomes. Either the answer was no, which felt like disappointment, or the answer was yes, and you could see what it cost the person who gave it to you. Both of those outcomes teach the same lesson. Wanting things is a burden. Needing things is a burden. So you stop asking. You figure it out yourself. You go without before you'll admit out loud that you're struggling. Research in adult psychology consistently shows that people who grew up in chronic scarcity report lower levels of help-seeking behavior during stressful periods, not because they don't have people around them, but because asking still feels like admitting defeat. And here's where the paradox comes in, because there always is one with this group. They are simultaneously the most financially anxious and the most financially resourceful people you will ever meet. They can stretch a paycheck further than anyone gives them credit for. They know how to make things work when things shouldn't work. They're creative under pressure in ways that people who grew up with a safety net often aren't. But they can also lie awake at 3 in the morning convinced that everything is about to fall apart, while their savings account sits perfectly healthy and their job is completely secure. The anxiety and the competence came from the same place. They weren't built in spite of the hardship. They were built because of it, and they've been running on that wiring ever since. Psychologists describe this as a scarcity mindset, a cognitive and emotional pattern where the brain remains oriented toward threat and loss, even when the external circumstances have changed. It's not pessimism. It's not ingratitude. It's a nervous system that learned very early that stability could disappear overnight and decided the safest thing to do was never fully believe in it. The 2008 financial crisis made this worse. Many millennials who grew up poor graduated high school or college directly into an economy that collapsed underneath them. Just when they were supposed to start building careers, building credit, building anything, the floor dropped out again. It confirmed everything their childhood had already taught them. You can do everything right and still lose, so why would you ever fully relax? But here's the reframe, because this is important. The same childhood that created the anxiety also created something else, a set of skills that people who grew up comfortable often spend years trying to learn: resourcefulness, adaptability, the ability to function under pressure without falling apart, the ability to read a room, to anticipate problems before they happen, to make decisions quickly when the margin for error is small. These aren't soft skills. These are the direct psychological byproducts of growing up in an environment where they were required for survival. The goal isn't to erase the wiring. The goal is to understand where it came from, to know the difference between when it's protecting you from a real threat and when it's just keeping you scared of something that isn't there anymore. Because the truth is, millennials who grew up poor didn't just have a harder childhood. They developed a different nervous system, one that is still working overtime to protect someone who is safer than they feel. They're not broken. They're not ungrateful. They're not bad with money. They're carrying a body that remembers what it felt like to not have enough and hasn't fully believed yet that those days are over. And that's worth understanding. Not to make excuses, but because you can't rewire something you haven't named. If this resonated with you, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. And if you want to support these deep dives, consider hitting the join button to become a channel member. I've got more videos in this series that I think you'll connect with. I'll see you in the next one.